Chapter 1. I'm sorry, Mayor Carol Dilfer said as she lowered the request form. You want over $20,000 for what exactly? The engine of a North American Aviation P-51 Mustang bomber plane, Michael Dyer replied, adjusting himself in the uncomfortable chair. He watched as the woman took off her glasses and gently set them down on her desk. She closed her eyes and rubbed at her temples like she had a headache coming on. It was a sight that was becoming very familiar to him. Humor me, she said. Explain to me why you need this engine for, whatever it was. A North American Aviation P-51 Mustang bomber plane, he supplied helpfully. Whatever. Why do you need it? He raised an eyebrow. Well, you did ask me to find a solution to the damage happening to some of the businesses in town. This is my solution. Are you being this obtuse on purpose just to annoy me? Of course not, Madam Mayor. This is a legitimate solution to a legitimate problem. Michael forced himself not to smile. He was absolutely being vague just to get a rise out of Dilfer, but he wasn't going to admit that to her. Every interaction with her since he had returned to Lamplight Woods a few months earlier had been frustrating, and he wasn't going to pass up an opportunity to return the favor. All right, walk me through it, Dilfer instructed with just a hint of defeat in her voice. As you know, I traced the source of the damage back to a family of gremlins living in the woods near the edge of downtown, he began. So you said, what do these gremlins look like? They're about, a foot tall, with black and green scales. They've got sharp teeth and claws, and a short stubby tail. They walk like apes, using their arms to steady themselves and move themselves forward. And they're dangerous? He shook his head. They're mostly harmless. They only eat insects, and they're exclusively nocturnal. They run and hide if they see a person. She pursed her lips. I'd hardly say they're harmless if they're causing property damage like they have been. You have to understand that it's a compulsion. It's not about the damage. It's about taking things apart. Gremlins can't help themselves. If they see some sort of machine or device, they have to take it apart. Then why are you not just exterminating these nuisances? Michael leaned forward, all traces of good humor gone. Because I'm not going to kill rare paranormal creatures when there's another solution, just because you want to make it easier to balance the town budget at the end of the quarter. Dilfer put her glasses back on slowly and glared at him. While she had agreed to allow him to take his father's old position as Lamplight Woods' paranormal consultant, she had clearly thought that she would be able to micromanage him and control him when necessary. He was making sure that she learned that wasn't going to happen. For generations, the Dyers had worked to protect and serve the people of Lamplight Woods. Unlike the police, however, they had always enjoyed a certain level of autonomy. They had devoted themselves to learning about and dealing with the paranormal. As long as they handled things as they came up, they were left mostly alone. Dilfer had used his father on multiple occasions during her time as mayor, and based on what Michael had pieced together through conversations, he had handled things however she wanted them handled. It made sense. His father had only really cared about the paycheck he received from the town. He would have been up for almost anything as long as the money kept coming in. Michael wasn't the same man as his father, though. He wouldn't compromise his morals for booze money. Fair enough, Dilfer said finally. How does this engine solve the problem? Once the beasts dismantle it, they'll just go back to breaking things throughout town, correct? Normally, yes, Michael replied with a nod. However, I've managed to track down a group of elves that can be relocated to the same section of the woods that the gremlins live in. Good lord, now there's elves. Don't think of elves as humans with pointy ears. That's just the stuff of fairy tales. Elves are actually woodland creatures that aren't very smart. With that said, they do have a special trait. They have the innate ability to fix anything broken. Basically, they have the same compulsion that the gremlins do, except that it's in reverse. They're also not nocturnal, so they're on the opposite cycle as the gremlins. Dilfer looked just the tiniest bit impressed. I think I see where you're going with this. We move the elves next door to the gremlins, and we put the engine between the two groups. The gremlins come out at night and spend their time dismantling the engine. When they return to their colony as the sun rises, the elves wake up and go about fixing the engine again. The best part is that the elves tend to improve whatever they remake. The engine will continue to get stronger and more complex. It's an infinite cycle, and the gremlins will have no reason to go into town looking for things to break. Why does it need to be this particular engine? He shrugged. It doesn't. I just really like saying North American Aviation P-51 Mustang Bomber. Not to mention that it's the cheapest plane engine I can find for sale from someone that won't ask questions. I know how much the good people of Lamplight Woods, and you in particular, enjoy not having the outside world know what's really going on here. She sighed. A simple car engine won't work? Over time it might once the elves have had a chance to improve it, but it wouldn't keep the gremlins' attention for more than a few hours early on. That means more damage to the town for a while. She sighed again. All right. Order your plane engine. I'll have the money in your account tomorrow. He stood up and offered his hand, which she reluctantly shook. I'll get the order placed right when the money gets deposited. It will take about a week for it to arrive. In the meantime, I'll get those elves moved and see what I can do to distract the gremlins until we have the engine. Michael left the mayor's office and shut the door behind him. A broad grin spread across his face. That had been even more fun than he had expected it to be. He took his phone out of his pocket. He had silenced it when he had gone into the meeting, and he found that he had a text waiting for him from Maggie Grant, both the town sheriff and a personal friend. Come by my office when you're done, the text read. I want to hear how things went. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and walked down the hallway. Lamplight Woods was a small town. Because of this, there wasn't a need for a separate police station. The town was in a period of growth thanks to a plastics company that had moved into the area, but until it hit a certain size, the sheriff's office would remain housed in the same building as the mayor's office and a number of other public service departments. He smiled to himself. Not that a larger station would have made sense anyway, as Maggie was currently the only officer in town. It had taken a while to adjust to small-town life again. He and his daughter Sarah had spent over 16 years living in San Diego, and while that certainly wasn't the largest of California's major cities, it had been large enough to make them accustomed to certain things. Although he had grown up in Lamplight Woods, there had still been an adjustment period when they had returned. Sarah had jokingly referred to it as decompression. He checked the time. It was just past 2 in the afternoon. He wondered what Sarah was up to on such a nice October afternoon. Chapter 2. Sarah made sure that the straps of her backpack were pulled as tight as they could be around her shoulders before slowly continuing down the narrow path. The water pouring down into the river from the waterfall splashed up onto the rocks, making them extremely slippery. She had fallen twice over the past couple of weeks, and she was determined not to have that happen again. She pulled the hood of her raincoat up over her red hair. It looked like the path ended before the waterfall, but she knew better. She reached what was seemingly the end of the path and made a sharp right. There was an even more narrow strip of rock here, and it passed directly underneath the waterfall. Water splattered against her hood as she entered the recess behind it. Directly in front of her was a large metal door. There was no handle or wheel to open it. She felt around the edges of the rock for a few moments before she found the hidden switch. Being careful to time the movement just right, she moved it up and down 4 times in a very particular rhythm. The door opened slightly, releasing a hiss of air as it did so. She continued inside and closed the door behind her. This side of the door had a handle. Her grandfather had installed it himself, and she supposed that he had figured that if someone had managed to get inside, getting out shouldn't be as big of a hassle. She made sure that the door was locked before continuing on. She followed the passage as it went deeper underground. The floor sloped gently, barely enough to notice if you didn't know to watch for it. The passage was lit by work lights placed at even intervals along the walls. The first few times she had been here, she had felt a sense of claustrophobia, but now she wasn't bothered by the close walls and ceiling. She reached a second door. This one was made of wood, and its surface was covered in ornate carvings. Under her house was a hidden chamber, and that chamber had the same door at the entrance. Not for the first time she wondered about the significance of the shapes, and also not for the first time she knew that she didn't have enough information to figure that out. Just one mystery on a stack of many. She opened the door and went inside. The room had been constructed by connecting two storage containers together. She had no idea how her grandfather managed to get those containers underground, but the metal floor, walls, and ceiling left little doubt as to what they were. There was even a visible weld that ran along the center of the ceiling. Long incandescent lights had been attached to the roof, their light bathing everything in a soft white. Both the left and right walls were lined with bookcases, filing cabinets, and shelves. All of these were packed full of books and other documents. At the very center of the room was a small desk with a very outdated computer sitting on it, and seated at the desk was a tall boy with glasses. Josh Taylor was her age, but the way that he sat hunched over the yellowed computer keyboard made him look much older. A large book was open on the desk next to him, and she watched as he flipped a couple of pages and quickly read something before turning back to the ancient monitor. He nodded to himself and typed a few keys. "How's it going?" Sarah asked, smiling mischievously as he jumped in surprise. "Holy shit, Sarah," he exclaimed as he turned around in his chair. "You have really got to stop doing that to me." "Well, that's just not going to happen, not as long as it keeps working." "You're an evil, evil woman. You do realize that, right?" "I'm evil, am I? Would an evil person come bearing gifts?" "Is that a trick question? The Trojan horse comes right to mind." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm pretty sure that the Greeks were supposed to be the good guys in that story, not the bad guys." Odysseus faked madness, cheated on his wife with Circe, and was extremely cruel to his defeated enemies. He and his men don't really fit into the good guy category. What did you bring me? She set the backpack down on the floor and unzipped it. She took a couple of plastic containers out, as well as two objects wrapped in tin foil. At her request, he put it all onto the desk. "You got Wally's," Josh said happily. "I got Wally's," Sarah confirmed. "See, you can't be mad at me when I brought you the world's best barbecue." "I suppose not. What kind of friend would that make me, right?" "Exactly. How's everything coming in here?" Josh turned back around in his chair and pointed at the monitor. "Slowly. I'm having to teach myself how to use DOS as I go. Your grandfather's computer system in the war room was bad enough, but at least that one had an ancient version of Windows." They had taken to calling the hidden chamber below her house the war room. It had started as a joke, but eventually the name stuck. She figured that it was as good a name as any. I'm sorry," Sarah said sincerely. "Thank you again for doing this. You're way better at this sort of thing than I am." "No problem. I'll handle the computers, and you handle any crazy demon monsters that want to eat us." She snorted. Back when they had first met, they had ended up having a very eventful week together. They had been attacked by a demonic entity not once, but twice. She had fully expected him to walk away from their new friendship at that point, and frankly, she wouldn't have blamed him. Instead of doing so, however, he had made it clear that he wasn't going anywhere. "Have you managed to find anything so far?" she asked. "A bit," he replied, tapping a few keys. "It turns out that this place is hooked into the system back at your house. I'm not sure how exactly, Your grandfather must have run cables all the way down to one of the main lines. So you're saying that you can access all the information from the war room right here? Right, exactly. At least I think so. I wouldn't know for sure until I've got a better handle on this DOS crap. Do you think it includes the security cameras? He hesitated. Actually, I know for a fact that it does, but you know how I feel about that. She held up her hands. I completely get it, and I agree with you. It's an invasion of privacy, at least the ones on private property. I'm only interested in the ones that show public areas. Josh typed on the keyboard for a moment. The monitor screen suddenly flashed, and a second later it was showing a view of the bridge that led into Lamplight Woods. The town was extremely isolated, surrounded by woods that stretched for miles on all sides. The only way in or out of town that didn't involve an extremely long hike was the bridge. Nice, Sarah complimented him. Look at you becoming one with the early 90s computer. I'm not sure this even counts as a computer, he said. It straddles the line between computer and overly complicated calculator. Well, whatever it is, I'm still impressed. She paused. Whoa, look at that. A car had come into view on the camera feed. It was a classic car, one that looked like it had come straight out of an old gangster movie. The image was black and white, so it was impossible to know what the color was, but it was painted a dark shade. The car crossed the bridge without stopping. From behind it came a long line of trucks. They were all shapes and sizes, ranging from moving vans to a full semi pulling a long trailer. The procession continued over the bridge and out of the camera's range. What's that all about? Sarah asked slowly. Chapter 3. So how far did Dilfer's eyes bug out when you showed her the bill? Maggie Grant asked as she leaned up against the side of the building. Michael smiled. As the town sheriff, Maggie was required to work with the mayor closely on a much more regular basis than he was. She had never even attempted to hide her true feelings towards the woman. He happened to share those feelings, and even though he knew it was childish, he strangely enjoyed their mutual distaste. A couple of inches at least, he told her. She agreed to the money, though? Maggie asked. I really don't want to have to deal with any more calls about stores and public property being damaged. She said the funds will be in my account tomorrow. I'll get the engine ordered, and once it arrives it should take care of the town's gremlin problem. How are you planning on getting the elves moved? She made a face. This is one of the weirdest conversations I've ever had. Me too, actually. Anyway, it shouldn't be hard. I'll just lure them into some cages with food. They're not like they are in the stories. They're wild animals that just happen to look vaguely human. Don't tell Jenny that. She grew up loving fairy tales. The last thing I need is my wife getting mad at me for disproving the brothers Grimm. Michael nodded. Understood. How are things going with her? Maggie made a face. Not much change on that front. She's still mad at me, and I'm still apologizing. It's been months. You'd think she'd be past it by now. He smiled sympathetically. During their first investigation together after his return to Lamplight Woods, they had been forced to confront demons. Not metaphorically, but actual real demons. At the time, Maggie had chosen not to tell her wife about what she was involved in, both because it was an active police investigation and because she didn't want to worry her. When they had finished, Maggie had told Jenny everything. The sheriff had been suffering from a feeling of guilt due to how things had turned out, and she didn't want to keep lying to her wife. It had taken some doing, but she had eventually convinced Jenny that what she was being told was the truth. Jenny hadn't taken it well. She had been angry that Maggie had been willing to put herself into such a dangerous situation. Michael believed that there was more to it than that, though. He was sure that Jenny was also mad that she herself had been made a potential target without being told that that was the case. He had to admit that she had a point. During a wild escape from one of the demons in an old house, Maggie had been cut by the creature. That had given it her blood scent, and it could have easily tracked her down if it desired to do so. Just by going home, she had put her wife in danger. Maggie hadn't thought of that, and she would never have put Jenny in harm's way intentionally, but it had happened all the same. He glanced over at the nearby woods. That particular demon had escaped and hadn't been heard from since it had taken part in killing the person that had summoned it. It was still out there somewhere. He had quickly found a way to stop the creature from tracking Maggie. The damage had already been done in Jenny's eyes, however. Still, he was certain that they would get through it. Things were already better than when Maggie had first told her, and they were very much in love with each other. It would just take time. Until then, he would just have to be there for his friend whenever and however she needed him. "Take a look at this," Maggie said, pulling him out of his thoughts. Michael turned in the direction that she indicated. Coming down the center of what could only generously be called downtown was an old-fashioned car. It was in pristine condition, and the sun reflected off of its crimson paint and silver chrome. "Do you know what that is?" she asked in an excited voice. "I'm not great when it comes to cars," he admitted. "It's a Bugatti Type 57. They're extremely rare. Only around 700 Type 57s were made across the 6 years it was produced." "How do you possibly know that?" "My dad is a car nut. It kind of rubbed off on me. That car right there is his holy grail. He's going to go crazy when he sees it." Maggie's father owned the Split Log, the local tavern. Michael had come to learn that the older man was extremely intelligent, and he enjoyed talking with him whenever they ran into one another. The car pulled up to the building and parked in one of the spots closest to the front door. He heard the engine turn off, and for a long moment, nothing happened. A number of people that had been going about their business had stopped and were staring at the vehicle curiously. The front door of the city administrative building opened, and Dilfer came outside. She smoothed the front of her suit coat with her hands before walking down the steps and coming to a stop near the mystery car. Driver's side door opened, and a man smoothly stepped out. He was dressed in a red button-up shirt with a black vest, and his pants matched the vest. His face was adorned with a neatly trimmed beard, and his hair was cut short. The mayor took a step forward, and he removed his black leather driving gloves before tossing them into the front seat of the car. He shook her offered hand and placed her other hand on top of hers. "Mayor Dilfer," the man said pleasantly, a broad smile spreading on his face. "It is an absolute pleasure to meet you in person." "Good afternoon, Mr. Liber," Dilfer replied without her usual abrasiveness. "I don't believe it," Maggie said quietly. "Believe what?" Michael asked, keeping his eyes on the two people by the car. "Dilfer. She's actually flustered." Michael took a closer look. Maggie was right. Dilfer's face was a bit red, and as she spoke to the man, she seemed a bit off balance. She even laughed, something that he had never heard her do before. It sounded rough, like she wasn't used to doing it. "Tell me, Carol," the man was saying. "Oh, where are my manners? May I be so forward as to call you Carol?" "Oh, well, of course," Dilfer replied. "That's more than acceptable, Mr. Liber." No, he said with a playful wag of his finger and a wink. "We're all friends here. You must call me Leonard." "Leonard, then." "I must say, I've never heard my name sound as musical as it does coming from you." She actually blushed. Michael felt his eyes go wide as he glanced over at Maggie. She was staring at the mayor in complete shock, her mouth slightly open. "Now then, Carol, tell me," Liber continued, grandly sweeping his hands towards the staring crowd. "Have you told these good people the news yet?" "I haven't had a chance to," Dilfer said, a hint of apology in her voice. "Excellent. I love being the bearer of good news. With your permission, I'd be happy to tell these folks myself, right here and now." "Oh, yes, please do." Liber turned towards the people that were staring at him from the sidewalk. As he did so, his eyes caught Michael's for just a split second. It might have been a trick of the light, but Michael would have sworn that there was recognition in that look. He raised an eyebrow, but by then Liber had already moved on. "People of the wonderful town of Lamplight Woods," Liber said, raising his voice dramatically. "My name is Leonard Liber, and today I have the absolute pleasure of informing you that the greatest moment of your lives is at hand." Everyone fell silent. If nothing else, Liber certainly knew how to command an audience. "For one night only, this coming Friday, and in celebration of the autumn season, myself and my partner, Mr. Maestru, will proudly present to you the world-famous, or perhaps world-infamous, Maestru and Liber's Carnival of Wonders and Horrors." The people began to talk excitedly amongst themselves. Liber let the noise build for a few moments before raising his hand for silence. The crowd obeyed. "Fun for the whole family, from the youngest of the young to the oldest of the old. Rides, attractions, laughs, and frights. A fall festival the likes of which you could never imagine. Everything that you could ever want, maybe even more. The gates will open at 7 o'clock in the evening sharp, and will remain open through to the next morning. Children of all ages are welcome until 10. After that, it's time for the grown-up fun, if you catch my meaning." A chuckle ran through the crowd. "5 days," Liber continued. "Just 5 days until the fun begins. All that you have to do is make it through one work week, purchase a ticket, and have your life changed forever. I hope to see you all Friday night." As if on command, a long line of trucks began to pass through downtown Lamplight Woods, heading towards the large empty field on the far side of the river that ran around the town. Chapter 4. Sarah stood at the end of the driveway, her backpack resting against her leg and her arms crossed over her chest. Over the weekend she had managed to avoid waking up early, but now that it was Monday, she had been forced to get up well before anyone should ever be forced to. She yawned. This was just inhumane. She had needed to get up somewhat early for school when she lived in San Diego, of course. It hadn't been this early, though. Since Lamplight Woods was such a small town, it didn't have its own school system. Instead, the students had to attend school in the nearby town of Craigsville. That meant needing to get up at the crack of dawn to catch the bus or, in her case, her ride with Josh. A strange sound came from her left. It was like the crackle of static, and the smell of fresh ozone accompanied it. She looked down to find a blue creature staring back up at her. Mira was an almirage, a mythical creature that somewhat resembled a bright blue rabbit. There were a number of differences, however. A small horn extended from its forehead, and it had a long bushy tail. There was also the whole being able to teleport from one place to another instantaneously thing. It had lived in the house well before Sarah was born, even before part of the building had been converted into a combination pawn and antique shop called Forgotten Tales. It was very intelligent, and it was a constant companion whenever she was at home. "You look a lot more awake than I am right now," Sarah said grumpily. Mira responded with one of its odd barks, a combination of a yelp and a growl. It tilted its head slightly in one direction, then the other. Standing up, it affectionately rubbed the side of its face against her knee. "Oh, believe me, I wish I wasn't going anywhere too," she said. "And yet I'm told that I have to go to school. Can you believe the injustice of it all?" Mira disappeared into thin air. Less than a second later, it reappeared laying across her shoulders. It rubbed its cheek against her face. "You know that I'd bring you with me if I could," she told it. "The last time was almost a disaster, though. I was barely inside the building when you decided not to listen and left the car. If someone had seen you, we would have both been screwed." Mira looked disappointed. "Don't worry, I'll be back later this afternoon, just like always." Dad will be here all day getting Forgotten Tales ready to reopen next week, so you'll have him here all day. I promise that we'll spend time together tonight, okay? The creature vanished and didn't reappear. Sarah reached up and ran a hand through her hair in an effort to get a few unruly strands to go back down. Mira was basically a walking static discharge. Whenever it got close to her head, it would cause her hair to stand up. She finally gave up and quickly tied her hair back in a ponytail. Lights appeared down the road as a car pulled onto the street. Forgotten Tales was set apart from the rest of Lamplight Woods, and there was no other reason for a car to come this way. She picked up her backpack and slung it over her shoulder. It was still slightly damp from the previous day's waterfall excursion. The car pulled into the driveway. She went around the front of it and got into the passenger side, smiling at Josh with all the energy that she could muster. It wasn't much. The car was small, and it took a bit of effort to maneuver her backpack into the back seat. "Ready?" Josh asked as he backed the car into the road. "Meh," she replied, sticking her tongue out. "Meaning?" "Meaning meh." "It's not that bad," he assured her. "It's Monday, your lightest class day of the week. I'm sure you'll find a way to fall asleep somewhere." "Yeah, I suppose." He glanced over at her. "Is everything all right? This seems like more than sleep deprivation." "Yeah," she said before immediately correcting herself. "No, I don't know. It's just... Well, I guess that I just wish that we had gotten further this weekend with figuring out what my grandfather was working on. Another weekend of wasted effort." Josh snorted. "That's one way to look at it, I guess. The other way to look at it is that in just a few months, we've discovered 2 working safe houses and roughly 4 billion tons of research that he did on weird events all over Lamplight Woods. For having a very limited amount of time each week, I'd say that's a good amount of progress." She sighed. "You're right, of course. I just wish that I knew how he planned to bring my mom back." "You're assuming that's what he was planning on doing." "Josh, we found a note with the words Evelyn Stone fleshed to form on it in his handwriting. What else could he possibly mean?" He shrugged. "I don't know. I'm just saying that until you know for sure, you shouldn't get your hopes up. It's a very strange phrase." Once again he was right, and in that moment she hated him for it. She quickly shook off the anger. He was only saying what he was because he didn't want to see her get hurt. She leaned up against the window. It was sweet of him to care like that, but right then and there, she would have preferred if he had just indulged her. Flesh to form. Those words kept popping up, first in her grandfather's journal, then in writings they discovered in an abandoned trailer, and finally in both the note they had found and in other documents in the safe houses. There was never any explanation as to what the phrase meant. It had gotten to the point of being infuriating. "At least there's something to look forward to, right?" Josh asked tentatively. "What's that?" she asked, still occupied by her thoughts. "The carnival this weekend. We're going, right?" "The carnival." She shook her head to clear it. "Oh, right, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it." "Same here. I haven't been to one since I was 6 or 7, and that one was at least a 3-hour drive away." She looked over at him. "Lamplight Woods doesn't have many parties or festivals, I take it." He shook his head. "Not unless you count the annual craft show, and you really shouldn't. A few dozen poorly constructed wicker baskets don't have anything on an actual carnival. I heard that we got really lucky. The only reason that it's going to be in town is because there was some last-minute cancellation in their usual schedule." He had managed to chip away at her bad mood, and she smiled. "It has quite the name, doesn't it? Maestru and Liber's Carnival of Wonders and Horrors." "Seems like the perfect name for a Lamplight Woods carnival," he said. "I can't argue with that." Chapter 5. Michael carefully examined both of the bowls for the 3rd time, and once again he concluded that he couldn't see any difference. He stood up straight with a sigh. He had been hoping to avoid doing this, but there was no other way to know for sure. Going out into the kitchen, he filled a pitcher with water from the sink and returned to the store area of the house. Being careful to stand back as far as possible, he poured water into the first bowl. He waited for a few seconds, but nothing happened. He turned his attention to the second bowl and repeated the process. After a brief hesitation, the bowl began to shake as a disgusting smell emanated from it. The water rapidly turned red, and as he watched, a skeletal finger emerged from beneath the surface. He quickly picked up the bowl and took it back into the kitchen, dumping its contents down the drain. The liquid was much thicker than it had been just moments earlier. "That's why you take the time to check things before putting them up for sale," he said to Mira, who was curled up on the store counter. He set the bowl that hadn't had any reaction on one of the shelves in the correct section of the store. Scooping up the bowl that had been cursed by an ancient Aztec shaman, he went over to the tall bookcase that stood flat against one of the walls. He reached around the side and flipped up the locking mechanism. The bookcase pushed away from the wall slightly, and he opened it all the way along its hidden tracks. He opened the door behind it and stepped into the hidden study. The study was a room that shouldn't have been able to exist. From the outside of the house, it was clear that there wasn't any space for it, and yet it definitely did exist. His grandfather, and later his father, had set up forgotten tales with all kinds of secrets, including some that went against the usual laws of time and space. The study was home to all sorts of items, everything from cursed to blessed to possessed, and everything in between. He opened one of the cabinets and carefully placed the bowl on the lowest shelf. The curse had mostly worn off over the centuries. Originally, it would have released an evil spirit that would have killed anyone near the bowl. Now it just turned water into blood and popped up a few fragile bones. He went back out into the store and shut the bookcase. He took a quick look around before he nodded to himself. It had taken months, but all the unnatural objects had been located and removed from the sales floor. All that remained were items and antiques that were perfectly normal. The front door opened, and Maggie came into the store. She wasn't wearing her uniform, and it took Michael a moment to remember that it was Monday. Since she was the only member of the Lamplight Woods Sheriff's Department, she was never fully off duty, but Mondays and Wednesdays were the closest things she got to days off. "Hey, it's looking great in here," she complimented him as she closed the door. "Thanks," Michael said. "It's almost ready for opening day next week." "What do you still have left to do?" "I've got some shipments arriving over the next couple of days with things that I bought in bulk. It's mostly everyday things just to build up inventory, but I've also got some antique lots that I bought from online auctions. I'm probably going to have to expand the store into the dining room to make room for everything." "Listen to you, talking like a real honest-to-God business owner. Sounds like a lot of work." "It shouldn't be too bad. I picked up some shelving units last month and stored them in the garage. It will be a day's work at most. How did it go with the mayor?" Maggie grunted. It was a short talk. I told her that I didn't appreciate being kept out of the loop about the carnival coming to town, since I was the only one that would be responsible for the safety and security of the town during the festivities. And that made her mad, Michael guessed. Actually, no. That was the weird part. She just calmly told me that not only were all of the permits and inspection reports in order and available for me to look at, but the people running the carnival had stated in writing that they would be providing private security and medical personnel as needed for the areas they'll be using. "That's a good thing, right?" She nodded. "Yeah, I'll most likely be dealing with a few drunks on their way home, but that will be about it. Unless something really bad were to happen, of course. I'd have final say on everything if that were the case." He shrugged. "It sounds like Dilfer has everything figured out." "I suppose." She furrowed her brow. "Have you ever heard of a carnival with private security, though? I get the medical personnel part, since it's always a good idea to have a nurse on staff, when you're dealing with lots of people, but private security? I know exactly nothing about traveling carnivals, Maggie. It does make some sense, right? If I had a large investment like that, I would want to make sure it and the people that are involved with it are safe. True. I guess I'm just being overly paranoid. He smiled. What you're being is a good sheriff. So what's up? Not much, really. Jenny is at work, and I was bored out of my skull at home. I figured I'd swing by and see if there's anything I can help with. I appreciate the gesture, but like I said, I'm pretty much done until those shipments arrive. She raised an eyebrow. What you're saying is that you've got some free time on your hands. Michael looked at her suspiciously. What exactly are you suggesting? You know exactly what I'm suggesting, she replied slowly, a sly half smile on her face. You don't mean... Yes, I do. Come on, Michael. I'm not getting it at home. I need it. I need it. He smiled. Far be it from me to not be there for you and your needs. Let's do it. 5 minutes later, they were sitting in the furnished basement of the house, each holding a controller connected to a well-used Nintendo Entertainment System. The familiar music of Super Mario Bros. 3 filled the room as they took turns working their way through the levels. They had discovered their mutual love for early generation video games, and ever since, they had slowly been going through the collection of games that he had found boxed up in the attic. There's a small army of people putting up flyers all over town, Maggie said as she maneuvered her way through a particularly tricky section. Warp whistles or no? Nah, let's play through the entire thing, Michael responded. Flyers for the carnival? Yeah, they're up in the windows of all the businesses. I talked with a couple of the owners, and they said that they're all being invited to set up booths to sell and advertise at the carnival site. Smart. Free advertising and helping the local economy at the same time. She nodded. I wouldn't be surprised if it was Dilfer's idea. Everything is supposed to be set up by Friday morning. That's when I'll be making my inspection of the site with someone named Sylvia Curioso. Damn it. I was never able to make that jump as a kid either. Michael started his turn. This should be quite the interesting weekend. Chapter 6. Do you need to go right home? Josh asked as they crossed over the bridge leading back into Lamplight Woods. No, not really, Sarah replied, watching a deer dart back into the forest as the car drove by. I got all my homework done in study hall. Why? She had managed to survive yet another school day, and now there was only one day left until the welcoming embrace of the weekend. It had gone relatively smoothly, but it still wasn't a pleasant experience. She had very little in common with the vast majority of her classmates, and Josh was only in a couple of her classes. I was thinking that we could go take a look at how the carnival preparations are coming along, Josh said. There's a fence around the entire place, but I saw them testing some of the rides yesterday afternoon after I dropped you off. Sure, she agreed with a shrug. She had almost forgotten that tomorrow was the day of the carnival. Everyone had been talking about it all week, and it was almost time for it to begin. She had to admit that she was feeling fairly excited for it herself. Between the months spent on her very slow investigation into her grandfather's secrets and her school schedule, she needed a break. It had been a long time since she had been to anything like a carnival. Her father had taken her to Disneyland a few times when they lived in California, and there had been a trip to Legoland that had been memorable for all the wrong reasons, but this was different. She couldn't put her finger on exactly why. This felt more intimate somehow. Instead of going to a theme park packed with people from all over the world, she would be attending an event with the people that shared the same town with her. Josh parked the car in one of the spaces along the main road and they got out. The carnival was being set up in the open field across the river, but there was nowhere to park on that side. As they walked down the sidewalk, she glanced over to her right at the three-tiered waterfall that was one of Lamplight Woods' most recognizable landmarks. It had been the first thing that she had seen when she and her father had moved there, and because of that, she felt an odd connection to it. They crossed the river and left the sidewalk to head towards the carnival. Her eyes were immediately drawn to the large Ferris wheel in the middle of the field. The metal was painted dark red, and the cars were black. The wheel towered above the rest of the tents and buildings in a way that felt almost ominous. Further back and to the right of the Ferris wheel was a roller coaster. It had 2 hills, the taller of which featured a steep drop down towards the ground. There were a number of loops and corkscrews. She was honest enough to admit to herself that she was a bit of an adrenaline junkie, and she looked forward to getting onto the ride. The other carnival attractions either weren't up yet, or they were concealed by the countless tents that had been erected. The tents were striped with orange and black. She wondered if those were the usual colors the carnival used, or if it was being used now to celebrate the autumn season. There were also a few more permanent-looking buildings that she could see. She couldn't tell what those were from this distance. On the far side of the field, the trucks that they had seen bringing the equipment into Lamplight Woods were parked in the grass. Between those and the temporary fence that had been placed around the carnival area was a line of trailers. They were likely the homes of the employees. They stopped when they came to the fence. Sarah almost leaned up against it before realizing that it probably wouldn't support her weight. It was pretty flimsy, and was obviously meant as more of a border than a barricade. "There's a lot more put up today," Josh commented as he looked at the tents. "My dad told me that Sheriff Grant has some sort of inspection tomorrow morning," Sarah said. "They probably had to make sure that everything was up before then." "Pretty impressive, isn't it?" a voice said from behind them. Sarah turned to find herself looking at a woman holding 2 plastic bags. She looked to be in her mid-20s. Her black hair was cut short on one side, and the other side went down to her waist. She was dressed in a black dress that managed to look both fashionable and old at the same time. "Sometimes I forget how all this looks the first time that you see it," the woman continued. "When you're around it all the time, it loses a bit of its aura." Sarah wasn't sure what to say to that. She also wasn't sure what to make of the woman. "I'm sorry if we're not supposed to be this close," Sarah said finally. "We just wanted to see how things were coming along for tomorrow." "Bah, you're fine," the woman answered, waving her hand dismissively. "The secrets are inside the tents, not outside." "Secrets?" "Of course. Both wonders and horrors. It's right there in the name. Maestru and Liber's Carnival of Wonders and Horrors." She smiled. "I'm Sylvia Curioso, one of the carnies and site manager here." "I'm Sarah Dyer," Sarah replied. "This is Josh Taylor." "Pleased to meet both of you." Curioso tilted her head slightly. "Dyer, you said? Any relation to Michael Dyer?" "He's my father. You know him?" She shook her head. "No, but I've heard the name a few times since we got here. It's been nice talking with you, but I need to get back. Come see me when the carnival is open. I promise that I'll make it worth your time." Curioso flashed them a final smile and jumped lightly over the short fence. It was only a few feet high, but it was still impressive that she managed to not only make the leap, but also maintain control over her shopping bags at the same time. She headed towards the carnival. "How will we know where to find you?" Josh called out after her. "Oh, you'll know," she yelled back over her shoulder. They watched her disappear among the tents. "That was interesting," Josh observed. "Sylvia Curioso," Sarah said slowly. "I'm guessing that's a stage name." "I can't imagine that it's a real one. Either that, or she won the name lottery. I wonder why she wants us to find her when the carnival's open." "She's probably going to try to sell us something. That's how it usually works, right? We'll find out for sure tomorrow."